This is going to be a bit of a tricky conversation. There are few topics that people find more uncomfortable to talk about than pornography, but I'm also well aware that discussions like this are sometimes framed as clickbait that's meant to shock you into watching along. I'm really not interested in doing that. But I want to talk about the adult platform OnlyFans because I recently read an essay by the writer and podcaster Ed Elson about how people's discomfort with talking about all of this might actually be causing a lot of us to miss a pretty seismic shift in our culture. One that's gone from people consuming pornographic content to now interacting with it. And it's a shift that gets tied up in a bunch of bigger debates about loneliness and screen time and how people engage with one another online. Ed has some pretty strong views on OnlyFans. We reached out to the company for a comment on his piece, but they didn't issue us a reply. And one more thing before we get going, some of the numbers in our conversation are estimates from third-party data firms. That's mainly because OnlyFans doesn't publicly release a lot of these figures themselves. All right, here's my interview. Ed, I think a lot of people listening to this conversation might think it's kind of a bit niche, but I do think OnlyFans has become so huge. So give us a sense of why people who might not be interested in this subject and might think this is just porn and I'm not interested in porn should be aware of OnlyFans and what's happening.
Yeah, this is a good point. I think the reason you have to care about it at this point is because of, as you mentioned, the scale. The number of people who are using OnlyFans, it's now 378 million people, which is more than the population of the United States. The amount of money that they're spending on this platform comes out to $7.2 billion. That was in 2025. So that's more than the GDP of Andorra. So, you might not be that interested in this platform, but the reality is this platform is absolutely exploding right now. And what I wrote about and what I've been saying recently is, when I look back at 2025, every year I try to pick my company of the year. And this isn't the company that's necessarily the best company or the most profitable company. It's the company that best captures the current moment, that characterizes our time. 2025, my company of the year was OnlyFans, because there is no company that better capitalized on the specific conditions of our time, specifically this chronic sexlessness that we keep on seeing among young people, among my generation, also loneliness, and also just a terminally online society. So we can get into what exactly OnlyFans is and how it works. The long and short of it is it's kind of like a porn platform. I call it Substack for porn. It's sort of creator focused. They use terms like creator and content and community, but ultimately it is hundreds of thousands of young men paying mostly young women for explicit and sexual content.
There's tons of free porn out there on the internet. Why pay for it?
That is the big question, and a lot of people don't fully understand this. The thing that you have to pay attention to is something called the private chat function on OnlyFans. And what people don't realize is that this is actually a gigantic piece of the business. This is a function where you get to pay money to talk privately with one of these OnlyFans creators, one of these OnlyFans models. So the big difference between OnlyFans and traditional porn is the fact that you're not just paying for the act of sex. It's not the visualization of sex. That's not the whole story here. The story is that you're paying for access to actually speak with and directly communicate with these women. And so this is why I say it's not exactly a porn platform, because it's also capitalizing on this very, very large issue in America and around the rest of the world at this point, which is loneliness. It's also filling this void of companionship. Millions of young men are getting online and paying lots and lots of money to simply have the privilege of messaging with their favorite OnlyFans creator, messaging with a young woman.
I'm not in business, thank God, because I would have been very bad at it. But it seems to me that, let's say I had been in business and I sold chocolates. I would have a vested interest in there being a whole load of people out there with a sweet tooth. If I'm running OnlyFans, it seems to me from what you're saying, I have a vested interest in there being a whole load of people out there who are lonely.
Yes.
And what does it say? I'm going to kind of zoom out for me. What does it say about our society and the prospect of solving this loneliness crisis if that very loneliness becomes monetizable and actually becomes a kind of business model, that businesses like OnlyFans, and I'm assuming there are going to be others, have an interest in people being lonely?
Well, I think what it shows is this business, like many great businesses, is predicated on monetizing an addiction and a vice that exists in many people around the world today. So, the chocolate example is a good one, but I think this one is this is a lot darker. There are other platforms which are monetizing and capitalizing on the loneliness trend. I mean, I think you'd have to point to pretty much all the social media platforms. You look at just the way that the life of a young person today is structured. We spend about 70% less time with our friends than we did around 15 years ago. And we spend about 70% more time looking at our phones than we did about 15 years ago. So I think you have to look at pretty much every digital platform. Most of them are benefiting from the loneliness trend because most of them are benefiting from the fact that we are not spending time with our friends, we're spending time on our phones. And so OnlyFans is kind of the most visceral illustration of a company exploiting that problem, because what you find among young people is because we're spending so much time on our phone, so much time on these screens, what's happening is we're subconsciously craving a level of connection and a level of companionship because we're simply not getting it in the real world.
Okay, let me put the counter argument, because I've listened to a few interviews with people who are defenders of the OnlyFans model, and maybe you want to extend it out to other things too, but let's focus on the OnlyFans, which is that actually in this kind of gig economy world that we live in, OnlyFans has given a lot of young women mostly the ability to make a lot of extra money, to be creators, to control their own business model and put out content there that people will pay them for. You're working multiple jobs, you're a student. This gives you actually just a little bit of extra money in your bank account.
I'm reluctantly willing to hear that argument out. What I would say to those people is you're not actually getting rich doing this. And the reason you're not getting rich doing this is because the top 0.1% of creators on the platform collect 76% of the total revenue on the entire platform. The reality is there's only a tiny, tiny handful of people who are making real money off of this thing. And then you have to remember there's also a ton of money that's being made by the owner of the platform. We could find some instances where, as you say, yes, young people are struggling with figuring out how to make a real living here. We're dealing with record housing prices. We're dealing with record college costs. It's not very easy to be a young person in today's economy, which could explain why young women would turn to this. And I'm not going to criticize them for it. But the platform itself and the scale that we have reached, ultimately, I think it's very hard to argue that this isn't a net negative for society. I mean, this is the new cigarettes. This is the new, perhaps the new alcohol, although it's probably worse than alcohol. But this is a company that's tapping into our addiction and monetizing it at a rate that is just staggering.
You end your piece, Ed, by asking what, if anything, should be done about this, and you don't pretend that there are easy answers. Do you have the beginning, I suppose, of a hard answer to what could be done to rectify this?
I think the first thing that young people should consider is you should consider just acknowledging the situation you're in. I mean, let's say that you are a young man who is spending your disposable income on messaging young girls. I mean, the first thing that I would say to you, you're not actually messaging a young woman. One of the things that we're seeing with OnlyFans is because these young women are getting so many messages, they are now having to outsource their messaging to what are known as chatting agencies.
Well, so you think you're having a relationship, but you're not actually.
You're not having a relationship. You're chatting with a guy who's behind the computer pretending to be the woman. That is realistically who you're actually speaking to. And these chatting agencies are now making a lot of money because this has become an entire ecosystem. It's an entire economy because these young women are getting literally hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of messages every week and every month. So the first thing you have to consider, if you're using this stuff, you have to get off. And I think that's the first step for young people, is sort of recognizing the situation. And I'm not saying that, young people should be scolded for finding themselves in this position. I mean, we were handed a very difficult deck of cards here. I mean, we were born in this online society where we were constantly glued to our phones. We were handed an economy that doesn't really work in our favor. And so I'm not criticizing young people for being in this situation, but at the very least, if you want to get out of it, you have to recognize what is actually happening. So that would be my advice to a young man who is using OnlyFans. This is doing nothing for your life. If you want to improve your life, if you want to improve your circumstances, you should really just get offline, and you should consider putting your energy into things in the real world. From a societal level, I think the question that our leaders should be asking themselves is, what do we do about this? It's not totally easy, because I'm not someone who thinks that you should just ban these platforms. I don't think you should ban pornography. But I think you can take little steps here. And I think the best example of a country that has taken some decent steps in the right direction would be Australia, which decided to just ban social media for people under the age of 16. And I think what that does is it weans us off of these devices and off of these screens that get us hooked onto these platforms at a very early age. It nips it in the bud. And I would hope that what we'll find in Australia is that a lot of young children, by the time they hit 17, 18, 19, 20, they're not so addicted to these devices. It doesn't become so ingrained into their life such that they start to convince themselves and delude themselves that the best use of time is to communicate for $20 a month to chat with a woman that they've never even met in their life. That's something that is very unique to our generation. And I do think it's a consequence of our screen addiction, our online addiction. I think if we could cut that off earlier, then that might move us in the right direction.
Ed Elson, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.